Welcome to the Revenge Vision channel. Today's story is about Paul Hayes. Let's get started. Thank you all for being here. Paul Hayes, 28 years old, stepped into the grand lobby of the Grand Ocean Resort in Miami on a warm spring afternoon. He had come for his brother's wedding. At the reception desk, he gave his name. The two staff members exchanged glances, flipped through the guest list once, then twice, and looked up with awkward pity. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the list." Paul pulled out his phone and called his brother. Music and laughter echoed on the other end of the line. His brother answered sharply. "Do you really think you'd be invited?" Paul said nothing more. He hung up, placed a small silver box tied with a white ribbon on the gift table among hundreds of lavish packages, and walked away quietly. No scene, no argument. Just silence. Hours later, during the reception with around 250 guests, Miami's elite old money families, Paul's brother picked up that silver box in front of everyone. He opened it. His face went pale, his hands shook. Within minutes, he was calling Paul over and over, messages flooding in his voice, trembling with desperation in every voicemail. But Paul never answered. Not once. To understand why one small gift could shatter a perfect wedding day and leave his brother so frantic, you need to know what was really inside that box, and the truth his family never saw coming. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit like, subscribe for more family stories like this, and leave a comment. Where are you watching from? And what do you think was inside the box? Let's begin. To understand why a small silver box could unravel an entire wedding, we need to go back to Paul Hayes' childhood years in Miami. The Hayes family lived in a spacious waterfront home in Coconut Grove, where palm trees lined the driveway and the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and privilege. From the outside, they were the picture of success. Paul's father, Kenneth Hayes, ran a successful real estate firm. Paul's mother, Kimberly. Hayes managed social events for high-profile clients, and Paul's brother, Derek Hayes, 3 years older than Paul, was the golden child everyone admired. Derek had the larger bedroom, with a view of the bay, the newest clothes from the best stores, and parents who attended every one of his soccer games and school performances. Paul, on the other hand, grew up in the quieter corners of the house. His room faced the garden wall. His clothes were often hand-me-downs from Derek, and his accomplishments rarely drew more than a passing nod. The favoritism wasn't always loud. It was in the small things, the way Kimberly would drop everything to plan Derek's birthday parties with catered food and rented bounce houses, while Paul's 10th birthday arrived without fanfare. That morning, Paul woke up excited. Double digits felt like a milestone. He imagined balloons in the living room, a cake with his name, maybe even a few friends over. He ran downstairs in his pajamas, hoping for the usual birthday ritual. The kitchen was empty except for Kimberly on the phone discussing Derek's upcoming baseball tournament. Kenneth had already left for work. Neither looked up when Paul entered. "Mom, it's my birthday," Paul said quietly. Kimberly covered the receiver. "I know, sweetheart. We'll do something later, okay?" She turned back to the call. Later never came. By evening, the house was silent. Paul sat in his room alone, staring at the wall, feeling the familiar ache of being overlooked. Then there was a soft knock on the door. Paul's grandfather, Marvin Hayes, stepped in, holding a small wrapped package. Grandpa Marvin, with his calm voice and kind eyes, had always noticed Paul when no one else did. He sat on the edge of the bed. "Happy birthday, my boy," he said, handing over the box. Inside was a leather-bound book of classic European art from the 19th century, and a set of professional drawing pencils, not cheap toys, but real tools, with soft graphite leads and precise tips. Paul ran his fingers over the pages, seeing paintings he had never known existed, landscapes that felt alive, portraits that told stories. "You have an eye for beauty, Paul," Grandpa Marvin said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "One day the world will see it too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Paul spent the rest of the evening flipping through the book, tracing lines with his new pencils. For the first time, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet passion that wasn't about competing or being noticed. It was just about creating. That gift from Grandpa Marvin planted a seed that would grow far beyond the walls of their Coconut Grove home. Years later, when Paul reflected on that day, he realized it was the moment he began to understand his place in the family, not as the second son, but as someone who could build his own path, even if it meant walking it alone. After the graduation ceremony passed without his family in attendance, Paul Hayes packed up his belongings and committed to a new life in Chicago. The ceremony had been a quiet turning point. Paul stood on the stage in his cap and gown, delivering a short speech about pursuing passion in art and design. He scanned the audience, hoping to see familiar faces among the strangers. The seats reserved for family remained empty. Kenneth and Kimberly had chosen to attend Derek's networking event with a major firm, instead explaining it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your brother. Paul accepted the news with the same silence he had learned over the years. After receiving his diploma, he lingered on campus alone for a few moments, watching other graduates celebrate with their parents. Then he walked to the parking lot, loaded his car with the few boxes he owned, and drove north. Chicago welcomed him with its towering buildings and sharp winds, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of Miami. He rented a small studio apartment in Wicker Park, furnished it with second-hand pieces, and began building his career from scratch. The first year was challenging. Paul created a professional portfolio on Behance, and Dribbble set up profiles on Upwork and Fiverr, and started bidding on small freelance projects. He designed logos for local cafes, social media graphics for neighborhood events, website banners for startups, and posters for community gatherings. Working from his tiny apartment, he often stayed up late refining designs and learning advanced tools like Adobe Illustrator and Figma on his own. His first paid gig came from a coffee shop owner who needed menu redesigns. The owner loved the work and referred him to a wedding planner in the area who needed invitation suites and signage for high-end events. Word of mouth spread gradually but steadily. A satisfied client recommended him to a boutique marketing agency, which led to larger contracts for branding packages. Within 2 years, Paul had enough steady work to quit odd jobs and focus solely on design. He incorporated Everbright Design as a sole proprietorship, then expanded it into a small agency. He hired his first remote assistant for administrative tasks, then a second for production support, and eventually built a core team of 5. The company specialized in visual branding for luxury weddings and corporate events, attracting clients from Chicago's affluent circles. High-profile bookings followed celebrity engagements, boutique hotel rebrands, galas featured in local magazines. Awards arrived quietly, industry recognitions, features in design publications, and even a mention in a national wedding magazine. Through it all, Paul kept his success hidden from his family. When Derek called to boast about his latest promotion or real estate deal, Paul listened politely, offered congratulations, and gave vague answers if asked about his own life. Still doing some design work here and there, he would say, letting them believe he was scraping by. Kenneth and Kimberly never visited Chicago, never asked for details. Grandpa Marvin was the only one who knew the truth. He followed Paul's progress through occasional phone calls, offering encouragement without judgment. Paul's decision to stay silent wasn't born from bitterness. It came from a deep understanding that his achievements would never fit into their expectations. Chicago became his refuge, a place where he could build something real without needing approval. He poured everything into Everbright: long hours, creative risks, careful client relationships, and watched it thrive in the shadows. By the time he turned 28, the agency had become more than a business. It was proof that the seed Grandpa Marvin planted years earlier had taken root, growing strong and independent, far from the gaze of those who had once overlooked him. In the years that followed his move to Chicago, Paul received occasional calls from Derek, calls that were mostly about boasting. Derek's voice would come through the line full of confidence detailing his latest promotion to senior executive at the real estate firm, the new condo he had closed in South Beach, or the exclusive golf club membership he had secured. Each conversation followed a familiar pattern. Derek would describe his achievements in detail, then pause for Paul's response, only to pivot quickly to a dismissive question about Paul's work. "Still messing around with those graphics?" Derek would ask, his tone laced with amusement. "You should think about something more stable like what I'm doing. Real money, real status?" Paul would listen without interruption, offering brief congratulations before steering the conversation elsewhere. He never mentioned the growing client list at Everbright Design, the high-profile wedding brands that now sought his work, or the revenue figures that had climbed steadily. He let Derek believe the narrative he preferred, that Paul was still the overlooked younger brother scraping by on minor freelance jobs. The calls always ended the same way, Derek satisfied with his own stories. Paul quietly hanging up. Meanwhile, Grandpa Marvin's health began to decline. The once vigorous man who had visited Paul in Chicago a few times now moved more slowly, his voice softer over the phone. He called Paul separately from the rest of the family, usually in the early evenings, when the Chicago skyline glowed outside Paul's window. Those conversations were different. Grandpa Marvin spoke about his collection of antique art paintings by lesser-known European masters from the 19th century and small sculptures that had traveled across generations. He described the brushwork in a landscape by a French impressionist, the way light fell on a marble figure from Italy, and the history behind each piece. "Art isn't about price tags or showing off," Grandpa Marvin would say during one call. "It's about what it makes you feel, what it teaches you about the world. I see that in you, Paul. You understand the meaning behind the work, not just the surface." Paul listened intently, asking questions that drew out more details, the origins of a particular painting, the story of how Grandpa Marvin had acquired a bronze statue during a trip to Paris decades earlier. The calls became a quiet ritual, a space where Paul could speak freely without judgment. Grandpa Marvin never asked about money or success. He asked about Paul's latest designs, what inspired him, how he felt when a project came together. Those moments provided Paul with something he had rarely experienced in Miami: genuine interest. Grandpa Marvin shared memories of his own youth, how he had collected art not for investment, but for the joy it brought him. He spoke of the responsibility that came with preserving such pieces, of passing them on to someone who would honor their true value. Paul cherished those conversations. They reminded him that his passion for design was not a whim, but a continuation of something deeper. As Grandpa Marvin's health weakened, the calls grew shorter, but the connection remained strong. Paul began to sense that these discussions were more than casual. They were Grandpa Marvin's way of preparing him for something important, something that would one day come to light. Not long after those private conversations, Grandpa Marvin Hayes passed away, and Paul's attorney Shane Mitchell called him one morning in Chicago. The news arrived on a quiet Tuesday. Paul was reviewing client proofs at his desk when the phone rang with an unfamiliar Boston area code. Shane Mitchell introduced himself as the lawyer who had handled Grandpa Marvin's estate for decades. His voice was calm and professional as he delivered the message Marvin had died peacefully in his sleep the previous night at the age of 84. Arrangements were already in place for a private service in Miami, and Paul was asked to attend. Paul sat in silence for a long moment after the call ended. The loss felt sudden, even though Grandpa Marvin's health had been declining. He booked a flight, immediately arriving in Miami the next day. The funeral was small, held at a chapel overlooking the water, attended by close family and a handful of old friends. Kenneth and Kimberly stood at the front, accepting condolences, while Derek remained nearby, composed but distant. Paul stayed in the back row, taking in the service without speaking much. After the burial, Shane Mitchell pulled Paul aside in a small office at the chapel. He closed the door and placed a manila envelope on the table. Your grandfather came to me several years ago with very specific instructions, Shane said. This is separate from the public will that was filed. He wanted you to have this privately. Inside the envelope were 2 documents and a handwritten letter. The first document was a notarized amendment to the estate plan dated 4 years earlier. It clearly stated that the entire antique art collection paintings by European masters from the 19th century, small sculptures, and rare prints valued at approximately $2.5 million belonged solely to Paul Hayes. Paul read the words twice before they fully registered. The collection had been a point of quiet pride for Grandpa Marvin, assembled over decades, with careful thought rather than investment. Derek and the rest of the family had assumed it would be divided or passed to the eldest son, as tradition often dictated. But the amendment was explicit and legally binding. The second document confirmed the transfer of ownership with instructions for secure storage and appraisal. Paul set it aside and opened the letter. Grandpa Marvin's handwriting was steady, the words simple but direct. Paul, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I chose you for the collection because you see what others miss. Derek and the others view these pieces as trophies, something to display for status. You see the history, the craft, the story in each one. Beauty isn't about possession, it's about preservation. Your parents will be surprised, perhaps angry, but I watched you grow into someone who honors what matters. Keep them safe and pass them on when the time is right. All my love, Grandpa Marvin. Paul folded the letter carefully and pressed it to his chest. Tears came quietly. The room felt still, the weight of the decision settling over him. Shane Mitchell waited patiently. Your grandfather requested that this remain confidential until you decide the right moment to disclose it, Shane said. The public will mention only general assets. No one else knows about the amendment yet. Paul nodded, unable to speak at first. He tucked the documents into his bag and left the chapel with a secret that felt both heavy and freeing. He flew back to Chicago the same evening, the letter tucked safely in his carry-on. In the days that followed, Paul thought often about Grandpa Marvin's words. The collection represented more than value. It was a legacy of understanding, a reminder that true appreciation didn't require applause. He decided to keep the matter private for now. There would come a time when the truth needed to surface, but that time had not yet arrived. He stored the documents in a secure, safe deposit box and returned to his work at Everbright Design. The agency continued to grow, but the knowledge of the collection changed something inside him. It gave him a quiet certainty that his path had been seen and valued by the one person who truly understood. 3 months before the wedding news of Derek and Zoe's engagement spread quickly through Miami's upper circles. Derek Hayes and Zoe Harris announced their marriage with a lavish engagement party at a private estate overlooking Biscayne Bay. The event drew Miami's elite real estate developers, socialites, and old money families who toasted the union of 2 prominent lineages. Zoe, from a family with deep roots in Florida commerce, wore a custom gown and spoke confidently about the details she had already planned. She made a point of mentioning the antique art collection during conversations with guests. It will be the perfect accent for the reception, Zoe said to a group of friends, her voice carrying across the terrace. Grandpa Marvin's pieces, those European paintings and sculptures, will be displayed as the centerpiece. They're priceless, really. The whole collection will make the day unforgettable. The comment spread through the social circuit. Zoe posted photos on her private Instagram, tagging the collection with captions about legacy and elegance. Derek nodded along, proud of the match that would solidify their status. The wedding was set for the Grand Ocean Resort, with a guest list capped at around 250 intimate by Miami standards, yet exclusive enough to generate buzz. Unbeknownst to Zoe, she had already signed a contract with Everbright Design for the wedding's graphic elements. The scope included custom invitations, menu signage, and digital assets valued at $10,000 non-refundable upon signing. Zoe had chosen the agency after seeing their portfolio online, impressed by the clean lines and sophisticated style. She never asked who owned the company, and the team handled the project remotely without mentioning Paul. Paul learned about the wedding and the contract through Paul's great-uncle Carl Hayes. Carl, Grandpa Marvin's younger brother, had remained close to Paul over the years. He called one afternoon while Paul was in a client meeting, his voice steady but concerned. "Paul, your brother Derek, is marrying Zoe Harris in 3 months," Carl said. "Zoe's been talking about using your grandfather's collection as the main decoration. She's also hired your agency for the graphics, signed the contract last week. She has no idea it's yours." Paul listened in silence. The news hit like a quiet shock. He thanked Carl for the information and ended the call. For the rest of the day, he sat at his desk staring at the screen. The collection, now legally his, was about to be displayed publicly as if it belonged to Derek and Zoe. The contract meant his own team would be creating the visual identity for the event without knowing the full context. He thought about the letter from Grandpa Marvin, the words about honoring the true value of the art. The idea of the collection being used as a status symbol without anyone knowing the rightful owner felt wrong. Yet he also knew confrontation would only escalate the tension he had spent years avoiding. After a sleepless night, Paul made his decision. He would attend the wedding. Not to cause a scene, but to be present when the truth inevitably surfaced. He booked a flight from Chicago to Miami, a 3-hour trip that would bring him back to the city he had left behind. He packed lightly, including a small silver box he had prepared weeks earlier. The flight took him over the Midwest and down the eastern seaboard, landing in Miami under clear skies. Paul rented a car at the airport and drove to the hotel, his mind calm but resolved. He had kept the secret long enough. The wedding would be the moment when everything changed. On the wedding day, Paul Hayes arrived at the Grand Ocean Resort in Miami, the oceanfront hotel already buzzing with arriving guests. He walked through the grand lobby where floral arrangements and soft music set the tone for the celebration. Paul approached the reception desk, gave his name, and waited. The 2 staff members checked the tablet, exchanged glances, then looked up with polite discomfort. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the list." Paul stayed composed. He stepped aside and dialed Derek. The phone rang twice before Derek answered, the background filled with laughter and clinking glasses. "Derek, it's Paul. I'm here, but my name isn't on the list." Derek's voice came through sharp and impatient. "That's because you weren't invited. This is my day. Don't make a scene." Paul paused, then spoke evenly. "I just wanted to bring a gift. I'll leave it on the table. Do whatever. Just stay out of the way." Derek hung up. Paul walked to the gift table, a display of lavish packages wrapped in silk and gold. He placed the small silver box among them, the white ribbon catching the light. The card read simply, "From Paul." He took one last look at the ballroom doors, white linens towering centerpieces, guests mingling with champagne, then turned and left the hotel. The reception began shortly after. Around 250 guests filled the Ocean View Ballroom, Miami's elite, chatting under crystal chandeliers. Derek and Zoe stood at the head table, radiant in their custom attire. Kenneth and Kimberly sat nearby, beaming with pride. As dessert was served, the MC announced a special moment for the couple to open a few gifts. Derek and Zoe moved to the table, laughing, as they unwrapped crystal vases and silver frames. Then Derek's hand landed on the silver box. He picked it up, read the card, and gave a short laugh. "A gift from my brother. Probably something small." He untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay an envelope with official-looking documents, a handwritten letter, a photograph of Grandpa Marvin and Paul together at an art gallery, and a folded contract. Derek unfolded the first document. His face changed from amusement to confusion, then to shock. The notarized amendment declared the entire antique art collection, valued at approximately $2.5 million, belonged solely to Paul Hayes. The second document was the Everbright design contract signed by Zoe for $10,000, non-refundable, with Paul's name clearly listed as owner. Derek's hands trembled. "This can't be real," he whispered. Zoe leaned over, her smile fading as she read. "What is it?" she asked. Derek thrust the papers at Kenneth. "Dad, look at this." Kenneth scanned the documents, his expression hardening as he recognized Grandpa Marvin's signature. Kimberly joined them, her face paling. Whispers began spreading through the nearby tables. Uncle Carl Hayes, seated a few rows back, stood up. He walked to the head table with steady steps. "I witnessed Grandpa Marvin sign that amendment 4 years ago," Carl said loud enough for those around to hear. "He was of sound mind. He told me Paul was the one who would honor the collection's true value, not use it for show." The room grew quieter. A guest at a nearby table pulled out a phone and began recording discreetly. Then Richard Langford, a prominent Chicago event planner who had hired Everbright for several galas, stood up from his table. "Paul Hayes owns Everbright Design," he said clearly. "They've done work for half the luxury weddings in the Midwest. Revenue's been over $1 million a year for the last 2 years. They're booked solid," more guests murmured. Someone else added, "I saw their portfolio Vogue featured them last year." Derek stared at the papers, his face flushed. "This is a mistake," he said, voice rising. "Paul couldn't have—" Zoe's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "You hired his company," she asked Derek. "You told me he was a failure." The video continued recording. Within minutes, clips began circulating on social media among Miami's social set. The truth had surfaced in front of everyone: Derek's assumption of inheritance, Zoe's ignorance of the agency she had hired, and Paul's hidden success laid bare. Derek pulled out his phone and dialed Paul repeatedly. The calls went unanswered. Messages poured in his voice, cracking in each voicemail. The reception continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests exchanged glances, the perfect day, fractured by the contents of one small silver box. As the plane lifted off from Miami carrying Paul Hayes away from the city, his phone began vibrating with relentless calls from Derek. The notifications piled up quickly, missed calls, voicemails, text messages flooding the screen. Derek's voice messages grew increasingly frantic. "Paul, pick up. This is insane. Call me back right now." Another one followed. "You can't do this to me. Not today. Explain what the hell is going on." The desperation was unmistakable, the tone shifting from anger to pleading. Zoe's messages came next short and sharp. "How could you humiliate us like this?" Kenneth and Kimberly added their own demanding explanations, insisting the documents must be forged or misunderstood. Paul silenced the phone and placed it face down on the tray table. He stared out the window at the receding coastline, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The reception had ended early. Guests left in clusters, whispering about the scene they had witnessed. Derek's carefully constructed image, successful son perfect match heir to legacy, had cracked in front of everyone. The fallout began almost immediately. The video clips recorded discreetly by several guests spread through Miami's social circles overnight. By the next morning, they had reached the old money families who valued reputation above all else. Zoe's parents, influential in Florida commerce, expressed private disappointment over the public display of dishonesty. The honeymoon was postponed indefinitely. Derek and Zoe retreated to separate homes while they took time to think. Friends in their shared social network distanced themselves, conversations turning awkward at events. Derek's professional life suffered too. His role at the real estate firm relied heavily on trust and connections within the same elite group. Whispers about the inheritance mix-up reached clients and partners. A few deals stalled, and his superiors suggested a temporary leave to let things settle. The humiliation lingered a stain on his otherwise flawless record. Paul returned to Chicago without responding to any of the messages. He blocked the numbers one by one, not out of malice but out of necessity. For 28 years he had waited for recognition that never came. He had accepted the role assigned to him, the quiet son, the afterthought. Now he chose something different. He set a boundary that was simple and firm. The door remained closed unless they walked through it on their own terms, with honesty and accountability. Back in his Wicker Park studio, Paul resumed work at Everbright Design. The agency continued to thrive, new projects arriving steadily. He spent evenings reviewing designs, meeting with his team, and occasionally thinking about the collection stored safely in a secure vault. He had no intention of using it for display or profit. It would remain preserved, a quiet reminder of Grandpa Marvin's belief in him. The story of the wedding spread beyond Miami. The video clips gained traction online, viewed by thousands who recognized the familiar pain of being overlooked in one's own family. Comments poured in from strangers who had lived similar experiences. Golden children favored, others forgotten. Paul read a few, then turned away from the screen. He had no need to explain or defend. The truth had spoken for itself. In the end, the consequences fell where they belonged. Derek faced the reality of assumptions built on favoritism. Zoe confronted the limits of status built on borrowed prestige. Kenneth and Kimberly saw the cost of years spent prioritizing one child over the other. Paul, for the first time, felt free. The lesson is clear for anyone who has ever felt invisible in their family. Your worth is not measured by their approval. Build your life quietly if you must, but never diminish yourself to fit their expectations. When the truth finally emerges, it does so on its own terms. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. It means a great deal that you listened to Paul's journey. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in his place? Or have you ever had to set a boundary like this? Your stories matter, and I'm grateful for each one.